In 1943, as the world burned in the Second World War, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding in British India. It was a disaster that would claim the lives of up to 3 million people. It happened not with the roar of bombs, but in the silence of starvation. For decades, it remained a ghost in the memory of the British Empire. This was the Bengal Famine. 3 million people. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the entire population of a city like Manchester or Rome today. They didn't die because of a natural disaster, a drought, or a blight that destroyed the crops. They died because the food that existed was kept from them. Let's set the scene. This isn't some ancient, disconnected kingdom. This is 1943. Bengal is a province of the British Empire, a modern administrative state with telegraphs, railways, ports, and constant communication with London. India was producing grain. Warehouses held supplies. Yet, in the streets of Calcutta, the second city of the empire, bodies lay uncollected. Children sat quietly beside their dying parents. Entire villages became empty as desperate families walked for days, searching for food that was no longer there. Hospitals were so overwhelmed with the sick and dying that they simply collapsed. Eyewitness accounts from the time paint a truly horrifying picture. They describe people just collapsing in public, too weak to stand, too exhausted even to beg for help. Starvation is a slow, agonizing process. It was happening in plain sight, a visible, relentless tide of human suffering. And all the while, grain was still being moved out of the region. Rice was being exported. So what went wrong? How could this happen? The roots of this famine were not in nature, but in policy. During the war, British authorities were deeply concerned about a potential Japanese invasion of India through Bengal. To prevent the enemy from living off the land, they enacted a series of what became known as denial policies. The first was the boat denial scheme. Tens of thousands of boats, the primary mode of transport for food and people in Bengal's river-filled landscape, were confiscated or destroyed. This single act crippled the local economy and the internal food distribution network. Fishermen lost their livelihoods overnight. Farmers couldn't get their rice to market. The second policy was rice denial. Authorities seized huge stockpiles of rice from coastal areas to keep them from falling into enemy hands. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Local markets, which millions depended on, disintegrated. Prices for the remaining food skyrocketed, soaring far beyond the reach of ordinary people. The first to be hit were those with no safety net: farm laborers, fishermen, boatmen, artisans, and the urban poor. They had no savings, no political power, and no protection. As the crisis spiraled, desperate warnings were sent to colonial officials in Delhi and to the government in London. Officials on the ground reported rising death tolls, mass hunger, and a complete breakdown of society. They pleaded for emergency grain shipments from other parts of the empire, like Australia. The response from London was slow, inadequate, and tragically dismissive. The British wartime cabinet, led by Winston Churchill, was focused squarely on the war in Europe. Military supply chains took absolute priority. Shipping was available, but it was allocated elsewhere. The food existed, but the political will to redirect it in time was absent. Internal government documents from the period, which have since been declassified, reveal a shocking level of indifference at the highest levels. Some officials tried to frame the crisis as an Indian problem, a consequence of local corruption or hoarding, rather than a direct result of British imperial policy. Churchill himself received repeated, detailed reports about the unfolding horror in Bengal. His response was not one of urgency or compassion. He made several now infamous remarks, blaming the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits, and questioning why Mahatma Gandhi hadn't died yet. He expressed more concern for the well-being of the Greeks under Nazi occupation than for the starving subjects of his own empire. The narrative from London was clear. This was a distraction from the real war. When relief finally did arrive in significant amounts, it was far too late. By then, millions were already dead. The famine had carved a brutal line through Bengali society, a line that perfectly mirrored the structure of colonial power. British troops stationed in India were well fed. European civilians were protected from the price hikes. Anyone connected to the war effort or the colonial administration was secure. But those without status or influence, the vast majority of the population, were left to fend for themselves. It wasn't a famine that affected everyone equally. It was a famine that targeted the poor, the rural, and the powerless. Those closest to the colonial system survived. Those farthest from it perished. After the war, when the famine had subsided, there was no great reckoning. No formal apology. No compensation for the families who had lost everything. In Britain, the story of the Bengal famine was quickly swept under the rug, a footnote in the grand narrative of wartime victory. But in Bengal, it became a deep, generational trauma, a memory of loss and abandonment passed down through stories of survival. The Bengal famine of 1943 forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. It challenges the idea that the British Empire was simply a bit inefficient or a system that was paternalistic but ultimately benign. It reveals, in stark detail, how cold, calculated decisions made in an office thousands of miles away can directly lead to the deaths of millions. This was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was a crisis created and massively exacerbated by specific choices, by warped priorities, and by an imperial system that fundamentally valued some lives far more than others. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the bravery of the soldiers who fought to defeat fascism, but it does complicate the simple, heroic story of Britain's moral leadership during the war. It shows that even as one evil was being fought, another was being perpetuated through negligence and prejudice. The Bengal famine is a powerful reminder that policy is never neutral. It has real-world, life-or-death consequences. And it shows that silence, when combined with power, can be one of the most deadly weapons of all. History, after all, doesn't end when the suffering stops. It continues in what we choose to remember, and just as importantly, in what we are encouraged to forget. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider liking and subscribing for more stories from history that deserve to be told. See you next time.